Once in a dark and gloomy forest, a pack of wolves surrounded a lone warrior. Their leader was a furious beast of enormous size and intelligence. Stepping forward amidst the aggressive growls of the other pack members, he addressed the brave warrior, asking him how he intended to fight them without sharp fangs or powerful claws. However, in just a moment, the lone warrior no longer appeared as weak and defenseless as he did before. Amongst the encircling wolves, who were growling menacingly, there was another creature. It stood on all fours, leaning its head toward the ground, cropping itself up with two powerful clawed paws. Its skin, covered in spikes resembling scales, was jet black. In the next moment, the creature rose onto its hind legs, standing at full height. This creature turned out to be a humanoid lizard with a menacing toothy smile and eyes that shone with bright red light. It also possessed a powerful physique that struck fear into anyone who looked at it. However, even after witnessing this, the pack leader was not inclined to retreat and let out a fierce howl following their leader's command. The wolves viciously attacked, but despite their numerical advantage, they still had no chance. The humanoid lizard effortlessly dispatched them one by one, using its clawed paw to swiftly end each wolf's life. This was because the lizard, like creature's primary weapon, was not its teeth and claws, but sweat and blood, flesh and bone. Stepping on the next wolf with its clawed paw, it instantaneously took the creature's life. At the same time, the pack leader, with rage in its eyes, watched as its kin were mercilessly destroyed by the once feeble warrior. Unable to bear it any longer, it let out a furious roar, then opened its massive jaws with sharp fangs and lunged at the lizard-like monster. But victory was not in the cards for it. In the next moment, the humanoid lizard intercepted the pack leader's attack, grabbing it by the jaw with its strong clawed paw. Addressing the furious creature it held, the lizard said that it consumed the bodies of its enemies and used them as its weapons. After sinking its sharp teeth into the wolf pack leader's throat, it declared with a bloodthirsty voice that it would kill him, and by devouring him, it would become even stronger in this world of magical beings with unique abilities. They were referred to as mystical creatures. A small number of people were also granted the ability to transform into mystical creatures. They served as prophets who worked for the betterment of humanity. But as always, where there was good, there was also evil. In this world, there existed embodiments of this divine power, which people referred to with trepidation as the demonic god. In the midst of a dark forest, a man was running. His silhouette was shrouded in darkness, while his breathing was erratic and heavy, rushing with all his might on his exhausted legs. The young man, with tears in his eyes and a desperate voice, was no longer able to scream. His vision was blurred, and he moved only by fear and survival instincts. The reason he was fleeing was an arrow loaded into a crossbow and aimed directly at his back. In the next moment, the sound of the released bowstring resounded, followed immediately by the painful cry of the fleeing man who was struck in the back by the arrow. Right after that, a joyful male voice could be heard laughing and celebrating the accuracy of his shot. The owner of the voice was a bald, middle-aged man dressed in light armor, holding a crossbow in his hands. Another man with long hair praised him for the shot. The sharpshooter proudly responded with a smirk that it was quite easy. The attacker's sword dripped with blood after murders for men lay in their own blood without signs of life. Their attempt to defend themselves had been unsuccessful, as there were more enemies, and thus their foes celebrated victory, while those who had lost forever froze on the cold forest ground before sunset. They needed to take anything of value, no matter how small. The bandits quickly searched the bodies and claimed their reward. "It's just a feeling, but today the forest feels particularly eerie," said one of the criminals. And with these words, the group of criminals began their journey. A group of 9 criminals walked through a natural alley of majestic trees, which, when darkness fell upon the forest, took on eerie shapes. The group was in good spirits due to their easy pickings. A sarcastic voice came from the crowd. What monster could be in this forest, and why would it be watching us right now? The crowd laughed in response. "Wait," shouted the group's leader, who was walking ahead. Everyone froze. The closest killer's face was covered in sweat, and even his thick beard and a hair hanging over his forehead. couldn't hide his fear. He wasn't alone in this feeling. Another criminal standing nearby shared his unease. It was evident even from beneath the black hood he wore. One of the bandits who stood at the center of the group and couldn't see anything, couldn't hold back and asked, "What's their animal carcasses?" The bandit replied heavily. His gaze revealed a horrifying sight. The trees were marked with claw marks from some creature, and some of them were torn in half and scattered on the ground. On one of the fallen trees hung the lifeless body of a dead wolf. Mutilated animal bodies were strewn all over, even in semi-darkness. Their gray bodies were clearly visible. Their eyes had lost their gleam, and bloody puddles flowed from the house. Martin, the bandit with slick-back hair, and the 3 days still don't, the nearest body, enormous chunks of light had torn the beach body, exposing its bones. The bitmen crushed Horan, as if this might have been a territorial battle, as one pack might fight. The answer from the criminal disturbed everyone. Not sure, but it looks like they were cut down unilaterally. It's something powerful. The bandit, examining the bodies nearby, suddenly say a bit. Martin and two of his closest comrades got up and headed to the forwings. "This is the corpse of a mythical creature." One of the ants said, "Parts of a massive black wolf with deep gashes on its height. Some berries of skin had been ripped off. Along with the flesh the beast had gotten with the height, bloody traces were everywhere." But the men were not coveted by taste. Instead, they were fixated on the young man leaning isolkas. It seemed as though the young man was dead. He had a torso and a commanding presence. Busha, with a broad belt featuring an emblem resembling a dragon's head. Zaubur and his arms starting from the shoulders were dead-back armored gauntlets on his wrists. His aunt were marble, sorting their thoughts, the bandit with the hood, and the man immediately noticed that the body behind them was Leropak. What this scoundrel be doing here? Martin asked Ping about a youth as they gazed at the carcass of the once fearsome beast whose fangs appeared ready to tear people to shreds. The bandit wondered if this young man could have killed the magical before he could finish voicing his thought. Martin play. Tell him not to be nonsense. No one cares how this vagrant pushed the guy even closer and stretched out his hand. Same thing. Yet see if he had any fuel before the bandit could realize his plan. Shocking shot through sleep, and he couldn't hold back his scream. What is wrong this to deserve the red lizard, the size of a yard? Dog clawed the man's leg. "Get away from me." The bandit shouted, trying to shake the text. A smile on his face, the bandit who had shot the young man who approached Martin, "But now to sing if I don't move," Martin said. Then he swung and struck. Suddenly, the man felt a terrible pain in his arm. Looking at the place of the greatest pain, he saw only a blood fountain where his arm should have been. His punch at the lizard never reached the target. Instead, his arm was cut off by a one-handed battle axe steam pin set through the forest. The bandits' comrades prepared to fight when they saw their comrade's hand cut off by a stranger they thought was dead. Before the one-armed man could say a word, the fist of the stranger, who had just gotten to his feet and was ready to fight, flew into his face. The bandit's face was deformed by the force of the blow. Blood seemed to be pouring out of his mouth. "Do not touch him without my permission," the stranger said with an almost demonic expression, "or I will kill you," teeth clenched in anger and a look full of hatred that you see on his face. The lizard ran up to the boy, and it was out from time to time, giving the impression that it was mocking. It points it's that prepared for the battle. He was not in the best shape after the fight with the magical beast. His body covered with cuts hurt, and his steps were heavy. The guy clutched the battle axe he was holding in his right hand and prepared to fight. "This bastard is starting a fight," one of the criminals shouted, seeing the fate of their comrade. The bandits pulled out their weapons and began to approach the guy. The crowd heard a shout from the bearded man. It was he who killed Hans. Their opponent was not silent. "But this Hans seems to be still alive," the young man's answer, and "We clout," Martin shouted out in anger, "You bastard. You think you can get away with this?" And then the bandit raised his sword in front of him, preparing to attack. The order was given to surround the guy. At the same moment, 3 bandits stood in front of the guy and pointed their weapons at him. "Fools," the young man said, pulling another AX from behind his back. Do you have someone who will mourn for you? If so, retreat before it's too late. The young man prepared to fight. His eyes focused on his enemies, as if he was about to rush at them. Those who saw the boy said that a red aura covered his body, giving him a menacing look. The rimlet bared its teeth, showing that it was also ready to fight. Some from the crowd shouted, and the three closest Colonel Lamar. The guy clutched the handle tightly in his hands. The two paired axes he was wielding were formidable weapons, a blade on one side and a sharp spike on the other, black steel with simple patterns engraved on it, and a wooden handle, the perfect weapon for him. A second later, he rushed forward. His movements did not resemble human ones. With remarkable agility, he rushed through the crowd of enemies, cutting off their limbs. "My leg," one of the attackers shouted, for enemies fell to the ground, screaming aim as they tried to stop the bleeding that remained in place of their limbs. Alston Lizard was attached to the guy's back in or Denifi, got to cling to the warrior's shoulder with its teeth and claws. Beard. Remember that he was a monster. Looking at the agility and strength of the young men, seeing comrades lying in their blood, seeing limbs that were separated from Roller's beard, Mitchell Bastard Martin said, standing on the young men while the boy was dealing with the bandits, Martin and two other criminals, anti-Bandura, raising their crossbows. The band scribbled, then the other one, and his men fired. The sound of air was quite round. The boy froze for a moment. Hypnotic to this, without time to dodge all, he twists her knees back and cover it with his body green. Liz got A in less than a second. A sharp pain penetrate his body. "COVID." The young man clenched his teeth to keep from screaming in pain. "Did we kill him?" asked the crossbowman with a scar on his eyebrow, a smile, ear toe bandit's face. Martin did not share story or in wit before he could finish speaking. A stream of flame-like energy gushed from the young man's body. This flame was black and red in color, twisting and swirling as it rose upward. This continued until the shapeless tongues began to take on animal forms. The heads of several animal-like creatures began to emerge from the black flame. In this chaos of shapes and colors, one could recognize the head of a lynx, a wolf, a lizard, and several other unknown animals. And the center of all this horror was a young man who was now screaming in pain on his back from his shoulders. Black lines began to spread like the roots of a tree that had spread out in different directions. It seemed that blackness had penetrated the boy's veins and spread throughout his body. The toothy faces began to merge into one shape with a roar, darkness, and chaos. Flame and madness mixed to form a head that was bigger and more terrifying than all the others, a black dragon. The dragon's huge mouth was gaping as if it wanted to swallow the moon. The bandits watched his or could not move. Fear paralyzed their bodies and souls. And then the bearded man said that it was a demon god. The guy almost lost himself. There was nothing human in his eyes. Only the flames of hatred and anger. The bandit's words brought the young man back to reality. His eyes became clear the moment he regained control. The tongues of flame that swirled above him dissipated, just like a bubble that bursts and leaves nothing behind. The crimson spectacle was over, and forced returned to its darkened imprint. The young and Faucini and gay friend did not leave his side, trying to help him. Somehow, Yamebi was smoking as if he had just been roasted on a fire, and this was not far from the truth. When he tried to get to his feet, he saw something strange in the trees, but he was not strong enough and lost consciousness. The night's darkness showed no signs of relenting to provide some illumination to the settlement. The villagers lit braziers on the main street. A few houses had lights flickering in their windows. However, the interiors were empty, as everyone had gathered in the square to inspect their incredible trophy. This small village was well protected with a high, nearly 3-meter wall and with sharpened stakes. It had 2 pairs of massive maiden tour gates manned with armed guards, the architectures to Scandinavian settlements. "I can't believe it," said the village leader, looking at the dead magical beast that had been brought here on a cart. The man with light hair, around 40 years old, examined the wolf once more. His eyes held surprise, even though he had seen a lot in his lifetime, as evidenced by the claw marks on his face left by the monster. "Did you really do all of this?" The man asked, turning his gaze towards the young man who was chained and tied to a wooden beam. His small companion had been pushed into a cage from which he was desperately trying to escape by gnawing on the bars. The young man replied confidently, as if he weren't bound by chains. "It would be better if you burnt at all," he said, pointing at the dead magical beast. "Tearing you to death would not have been enough." Martin shouted in anger. He was about to start making good on his threat, but the elder's hand stopped him. The elder approached the boy and asked him his name, Ananta. The boy answered, "I do that." The old man continued to ask Anuna, "I was hungry." Martin intervened in a conversation, saying that one should not listen to this monster. Everyone had seen him turn into a beast. He mentioned the recent rumors about the monster eating corpses. Martin continued to insist that Ananta was not human, and he showed the scars of a wolf as proof, drawing attention to the places where the flesh had been eaten. He insisted that the boy was a demon god in human form. Ananta began to laugh, and his mood improved greatly. When Martin asked him why he was laughing, he replied, "He said that if Ananta was really who he was taken for, then these weak chains would not hold him." His words, once again, sowed horror in those around him. A bird flew overhead in the cloudless sky. "You know nothing, including what the monster eats." It said, splashes of blood poured over the doused elders. He did not understand how it happened. The mystical beast that had just been dead had torn the cords that tied him to the cart, and had first of all eaten the nearest soldier. Ananta noticed that this creature's existence was reduced to being the hands and feet of a demon god. Meanwhile, an endless stream of half-rotten wolves poured into the main gate. Their army was led by a mystical beast who pointed to the gate with his hand raised. His army completely obeyed him, and despite the crossbow fire, Miliot's wolfgang and jumped on the walls. A tower of animals formed at the foot of the gate. The animals climbed on top of each other, creating steps of bodies. The soldiers defending the gate from the inside could not resist the enemy. Although the wolves climbed over several individuals, there was no chance of escape for men unprepared for such a thing. The animals tore people to pieces. They bit off their heads and ate their insides. Martin was attacked by two wolves, and while one was biting into his arm, the other one, which had no flesh on the part of his skull, bit the man's neck. In all the chaos, no one noticed that one of the braziers fell on the fence and started a fire. Surprisingly, this fire could have saved people's lives. The fence burned more and more, and with it the dead animals that continued to go over it, as Wendigo watched his army burn nosed with the fence and fall at his feet. It was the severed head of Still Beast. Thirst and hunger come together to break free, buns, flesh, and bone. I am fully prepared to eat the word the dark lizard, addressed to the monster that led the pack. Norma Beast approached the fence and broke it like a matchbox house. The sacked and shattered under the onslaught of fire that left it no chance. The Fenman failed, and the village was left without its protection. Ulcer lies. Ash was making its way through the wall. Spits, what soul burned with anger? I will disfigure you. I destroy you. I wake, look like a prey on the verge of death. Fauna creature, a tall, almost. His face looked like a half-rotten cat. Also knows there was only a dip, a void. Saw ice at the enemy, and long horns grew from the top. The skull, though, looked more like branches with one main stem and several units paper for the elongated body with black and thicker fur on its jet amps and cinnamon to tree roots growing on its back. The beast's arms were extremely long. Even when it stood on its feet, the fingers of its hands daggled in the ground. Black foot and mouth. Disease got to its feet. Its appearance inspired respect and admiration. Massive build, muscularity and power, no vulnerable spots. Its entire body covered with hard scales, and its mouth lined with sharp teeth. Its eyes were blazing red, and it was anticipating a massacre. The magical beast let out a piercing scream. This cry was not a warning, and it was an order. Beasts under the control of the Wendigo began to appear from the dark forest. His army of magically controlled beasts consisted of wolves, a goat, a deer, and a wild boar. Total obedience. With a shout, the slaves rushed at the lizard, the glint in their eyes saying that they no longer knew fear or anything else, only obedience to their master. The boar and goat were the first to reach the enemy and tried to attack with horns and tusks, and nothing happened. They could not cause any wounds or discomfort to the lizard with its powerful arms. The black serpent caught their heads, which looked like fragile flowers in its huge hands, and slammed them to the ground after breaking everything that was fashionable. Their faces were no longer recognizable, and they turned into a mess of flesh and bones. After ending their lives, he began to step forward with his swift strokes. Ananta divided his opponents into two until only their leader remained. The enemies met each other's eyes as if the dark serpent had seen the very essence of the Wendigo. The latter wriggled furiously. This was the signal, and both monsters rushed forward, claws bared to attack. Their clash shook the ground, and the opponents struck each other an endless number of times. Drops of blood flew in every direction, but they didn't seem to notice the blows that could have brought down trees or the wounds that bled. The black lizard roared. The Wendigo's swift kick hit it right in the face. Victory was near, the Wendigo thought, until he realized that the lizard's claws were clinging to his wrist. It was not impossible to retreat, and the grip was dead in a split second. When the Wendigo hesitated, the lizard struck the beast's head with its hand. The blow was so strong that the skull could not withstand it and cracked, and the body flew several meters in front, leaving the animal's arm in the lizard's clutches like a trophy. The lizard's body began to fly off Anuntha, as if in flames, until he looked like a man. Slowly, the boy approached the mutilated body of his enemy. The beast began to decompose, and a black liquid flowed from the body of the beast, exposing the ribs. Then the body of a white-haired girl appeared from the monster's carcass, like a caterpillar cocoon, having finally torn her out of the flesh that covered her. The boy grabbed the girl by the neck and lifted her off the ground. Straining his wrists, he began to slowly strangle her. The gleam in her blue eyes almost faded, looking at her Bukabyung, and thought perhaps she had been unconscious all this time. While they were struggling, a strong wind suddenly picked up, and the boy concentrated on finding the cause of his uneasiness. Instinct told him that someone was watching him, but who? A whistle from the attack cut the silence, and the young man was unable to react to the enemy and was injured. Blood gushed from his right shoulder. Notable turning around, the guy finally noticed the Emmy, and the large vulture was maneuvering in the air, all the greatness of which can be seen only when it spreads its powerful wings. The vulture descended to the ground and said, "You were a real god, demon who devoured corpses. I have been watching you since you stepped on this earth." As he said these words, the vulture's feathers began to fall off, and the little May appeared underneath. He had heterochromia, and his eyes were different colors. His cloak resembled bird wings. His clothes were covered with bird skulls and other similar symbols, and his collar was made of down. Before he could finish speaking, the body of the girl Ananta had dumped flew into his arms. The guy almost was Lee, while the old man was muttering to himself, "Adidas, when I said the young man was not interested in this conversation. Want to kill his opponent." The old man began this, "I'm growing arms for combat." At the same time, Hibuka allowed him to control spirits, and if he killed the lizard, he would get a much better one, better than some deer or wolf. It was no longer just a giant bird. This creature had arms, legs, and wings. Raising its wings, the beast said one word, "Phantom." An aura appeared around the bird, and it began to buka territory from contact with it. Every dead person, whether it was animals that had already died twice or people who had given their souls to God not long ago, began becoming part of the army of the dead. The best out and now buka, the barricade of corpses, rushed at the young man. A few seconds later, the boy was being torn apart by wolves that had their fangs in Ananta's arms and legs. At this time, the dead soldiers stabbed the boy with their spears, inflicting a piercing wound to his stomach and chest. Seeing that the boy was not a threat, the vulture flew up to Ananta and dealt him the final blow with its clawed hand. Let a muffled cry, the vulture said, "Per Fausini," abuse of the monster. The boy spat blood from his mouth, and not an instant, everything was filled with a red glow. A pillar of aura rose above the boy. It twisted and divided until the mouths of various mystical creatures began to form. Toothy smiles appeared here and there, and then disappeared in the flow of energy. And above them rose the head of a black dragon. which was much larger than the other mouths. And the center of all the chaos was Ananta. His body did not change into the body of a lizard. Instead, he seemed to be covered with an armor of fire and darkness. He had a terrible smile on his face. It was clear that the slaughter and killing, his complete dominance over the enemy, brought him pleasure and happiness. The vulture was frightened. He had never seen such power before. It was too late for the vulture to escape. The dragon's head opened its mouth and charged at him with one bite. The dragon bit off the bird's upper body and swallowed it. Blood flowed like a river from the bird's wounds and mouth, and only the torso and two wing branches remained, but the life did not leave the vulture. Horror, fear, and despair overwhelmed the vulture as it fell into the dragon's throat and saw hundreds of jaws, claws, and beaks coming at it. The creatures of fire and darkness took him into their arms, tearing, biting Harrison, what once been a mystical beast, the latter's suffering and open under that bird's head with its jaws and crushed its head. The first thing the white-haired beauty saw was the dragon Sapphire cling to Young in body as if seeking refuge in it. She was a size, running towards say a word. Wait, please wait. Hear me out. If you enjoy this video, how about you subscribe, like, and hit that notification button so that you will be able to be notified when I upload another video.